Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the AI Forecast, a weekly podcast that explores the past, present, and future of enterprise AI with leading companies and industry experts, all proudly sponsored by Cloudera. Now, if you haven't already, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss an upcoming episode. I'm your host, Paul Muller, and this week we're talking to futurist and author of The Algorithmic Leader, amongst other books, Mike Walsh. We're going to take a look into some of his past predictions, which I'm sure will scare him, and we'll see how they played out. We'll also look at his observations on the adoption of AI and agentic technology today, and end with his forecast on where he thinks business and governments might be heading. Now, for those of you not familiar with Mike's work, well, you might want to change that right away. In addition to being one of my favorite public speakers on the topic of technology, he's the author, as I mentioned, of multiple books on the topic and is CEO of consulting firm Tomorrow, which is a business focused on helping other organizations, government and enterprise, adopt and adapt to the challenges of the digital age. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's nice to be working with somebody in the same time zone. You're back in Australia for a short trip, I understand?
Yeah, it's always nice to be home.
There you go. I like that you call it home. Where is home when you're not here, other than an aeroplane?
I'm mainly in London and Miami these days.
There you go. Miami's rapidly turning into the center of the universe, isn't it?
Yes.
Hey, before we get into the topic of technology, and I want to talk a bit about your books, as I said, some of your predictions in the past as well. We have something we do to start each episode off. We call the Fast Four, the lightning round. You ready to do it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. First up, what would people who know you best, your family, your friends, your work colleagues, what would they say is your superpower, Mike?
I'd say joining the dots on complex issues, technologies, cultural shifts, I guess in a non-obvious, hopefully entertaining way.
Definitely entertaining. We'll can a big thumbs up on that one. No notes. What would you say the most impactful technology of all time is?
I think my answer might surprise you. I would say storytelling. And it's funny to think of it as a technology, but it's kind of like it's basically powers the cultural operating system that runs civilization as its application. I mean, if you think stories are a form of data compression, transmission, it's an interface, it's a problem-solving tool, it's kind of a shared code base.
Well, and I'd agree with you. And I think if we had Richard Dawkins on the show, the pioneer of the concept of memetics, the meme, the original author of the meme, for those of you who shared, those of you sharing GIFs thinking you figured it all out, read Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. But yeah, I think he'd agree with you. It's the new way of transmitting ourselves forward in time.
And it's what large language models are using to bootstrap themselves into consciousness.
There you go. I like that. Well, controversial topic. We'll get to that in a second. All of this talk about AI and automation, it's fabulous stuff. But, you know, I think we lose the personal element. What would you like to see AI automate for you in your future, personally?
Well, if you look at people that are very wealthy, the big difference between them and us, and I presume us, that they somehow have this staff that takes care of all the moving pieces in their life. And for me, if AI could start to do that, it basically allows you to tap into the most valuable resources that cannot be replenished, which is time and attention. I think even now, you know, using ChatGPT to write an email is kind of sad and pathetic. But the day where, without doing anything, these agents can proactively just take care of everything that you don't really need to think about, that would be magical.
All right. I've got a question for you specifically on that a little later on, so strap in.
All
right. Last but not least, I figured out probably about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer than that I had a couple of hacks when it came to dealing with data, fresh data, old data, things that gave me a bit of an edge as an executive. What are some of the best practices or hacks that you've learnt when working with data?
You mean personally?
Yeah.
I think now really just not thinking about it too much. In that, in the old days, we would have a lot of busy work about trying to tidy data, organize it, put it into folders, label it, categorize it. It's the kind of people that would make a chart with highlighters about what they were going to do before they did it. Whereas now, and I think particularly in the last 18 months, all you actually need is good questions. So if you spend your time thinking about the questions you have of the data rather than necessarily organizing the data, the chaos and lack of structure is no longer a barrier to insight.
I think that is a brilliant answer. I'll take that. Hey, let's jump into the meat of the podcast. How did a bloke from Oz come to find himself an international futurist?
Yeah, it sounds like an international fugitive from justice when you say it like that.
It really does.
People often ask me this question. I say the best way to be a futurist is to start by being a failed lawyer, which is what I was. But fortunately, I failed at a time when probably was really conducive to doing more interesting things, which was the late 90s. And in the late 90s, of course, you might remember here and everywhere in the world was the first internet boom. So rather than going into management consulting, which is what I was meant to do, I set up my first internet company, which was the Asia Pacific operations of Jupiter Research. And I don't know if you remember that name, but it used to be alongside Forrester and Gartner as one of the companies that was basically doing the first consumer research into how people were using digital platforms. And so we ran huge events in this region, newsletters. It was a prototype version of the technology news networks that we all rely on today. But that's how I got my start. And then I was doing for a while digital strategy for the Murdochs at News Corporation up in Hong Kong in particular. But in my early 30s, I wrote my first book, which was Futuretainment. And then I realized I really didn't want to work for anybody else anymore, and I started speaking, and I really, that was 20 years ago. So that's pretty much been the path.
And you are one of my favourite speakers. I'm not sure if your legal training gave you your oratorical powers, but they are. You're fun to listen to. You've got a cheeky sense of humour, and it's always a blast.
Oh, thank you.
Hey, I am unfortunately you've got the word futurist in your title, and as you know, it is a condition of being a futurist that you have to occasionally look back and deal with the fact you might have gotten something wrong or outrageously optimistic. The Dictionary of Dangerous Ideas has its 10th year anniversary this year. You published in 2015, if memory serves. How have those predictions stood up to time, and have you had any surprises coming out of it as you look back?
Gosh, I can't even remember what I wrote in that thing. I think I wrote the whole thing. I literally, I shouldn't even tell you this. I wrote the whole book in a diner in Hollywood in a week because I had a big client who I'd promised a new book to, and they couldn't publish. The printers couldn't print the other one fast enough. Anyway, it's a long story, but I'm trying to think of the ones that didn't have the ones I did get right about that is that I talked a lot about the rise of the commercial space industry, microsatellites, cryptocurrencies. So this was written in 2012. So this stuff was around, but it wasn't as popular. Drones, of course. I think I overestimated some of the things around precision medicine. I thought that was going to happen sooner than it has. Although maybe you could say that mRNA breakthroughs were a good thing.
I mean, if you think about the precision of actually forget a scalpel, a robotically guided scalpel. I mean, if you're literally manipulating molecules, it's a lot more precise, I suppose.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of the stuff around nanotech just never materialized in the way we thought. And that's not even 10 years, even 20 years ago, we thought that was going to arrive. But autonomous cars, I think, pretty much have arrived. If you're spending time now in California and you've ridden a Waymo, that's pretty much working now.
Yeah, it's and the good example of where legislation is probably lagging the technology. All right. Well, it sounds to me like you might want to go back and flick through that and
yeah. No, you know what? I don't even read. I don't even read the articles I write myself.
Well, you're a futurist, I suppose. Yeah. Well, once we've written it, it's officially someone else's problem for historians. You're currently talking a lot about the fifth industrial revolution. We'll move safely into territory which is into the future. What's the big idea of the fifth industrial revolution, and what do you see as the opportunity for our business audience?
I think the question to start with is, what were the other four? Uh, um, and because people are still talking that we are in the fourth industrial revolution. So just to clarify, that I think that we've had five revolutions, or we're having five revolutions. The first, non-controversially, was steam. And then we had electricity, computation in the 1950s. Then the fourth revolution, people argue a little about this, but let's just say there was a bunch of interesting things that happened in the late 90s, 2000s, which included the internet, the mobile internet, the Internet of Things, sensors. Those things basically had a huge impact, not just on our lives as consumers and how we communicate, but critically from an industrial standpoint, they changed production and manufacturing. So we started to be able to create digital twins and automate production processes, bring more data and computation into running these processes. Now, I think we probably weren't on track to having a fifth industrial revolution until probably the 2030s. But then something we didn't expect happened, which was COVID-19. The world shut down. People made massive investments, not just in face masks and protective gear, but critically for this story, they made massive investments in digital transformation, in cloud, in data infrastructure, which is appropriate for today's discussion, in robotic process automation. And I think unknowingly what we did was not just discover remote work. In the background, we accelerated the forces which brought a fifth industrial revolution forward. And that is one, I believe, powered by AI. And a couple of years ago, people were very focused on generative AI because it was this amazing, shiny new tool, which could help you break up texts to your partner, cheat on your homework if you're a kid, create funny pictures of world leaders dancing and kissing in the street. But it turned out that actually would have a much more useful purpose, which we're just discovering in the last few months, which is really as a control interface for giving commands to and teaching a new form of embodied intelligence, which is AI agents and eventually humanoid robotics. And this, I believe, is going to be basically a form of digital labor, which will be the catalyst to, I think, transforming productivity in almost every industry.
All right, well, let's dive into that then. And I'd love to talk to you a bit more about the fourth industrial revolution at some point in time, because I do think there is something about mass instantaneous connectivity, near real-time instant connectivity, that we have forgotten because it's been pervasive now for probably the better part of about, 20 years. I think most of us have forgotten what it's like not to be able to instantly get in touch with someone, work out where you are, work out where my product is in the world. That enabler, I've been reading a bit of history about different topics, and you go back to these sort of circa 1910 to turn of the century, 20th century stuff, and you read about people writing letters and getting a response 4 weeks later to their ideas, like Einstein, for example, working on relativity. That whole notion of latency of communication has completely disappeared, and I don't think people understood the flywheel effect that would have. And the compounding interest we've had on that over the last 100 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like I said, there are elements of the fourth industrial revolution which are still in play. And we haven't. Not everyone's fully tapped into the power, as you say, of instant communication, even factories and manufacturing that fully leverage that. But if you haven't caught up already, there's already a new movie in the that's rolling in the theaters, right? So, and this is where we're going to get a divergence between parts of the world. Parts of the world will still be very much stuck in the third industrial revolution, while others are powering ahead on the fifth.
Well, today we talk now agentic AI agents. Is if you think about it, I hate to use the phrase evolution when it comes to this technology because it has its own loaded connotations. But agents, as you mentioned at the beginning, are something that businesses are looking at deploying. Do you want to talk about where you think, well, what is the state of the AI agent, the autonomous AI agent? Where do you think they're going to have the most impact?
Yeah, so first of all, let's define what an agent is, because people have different views on this. I mean, probably in the simplest terms, I think this was actually a phrase that came from an internal memo at OpenAI. They defined an AI agent as a system for taking action. And I kind of like that because, some people try to be semantic and say, look, unless there's this level of cognitive autonomy, it's not an agent. Look, there's going to be, just like if you think about robots in the Star Wars universe, there's lots of different robots that do lots of different things, and agents will be the same. And sometimes agents will be, I guess, pretty kind of deterministic, not so different to the robotic process automations that were in that delivery center in India that we talked about 5 years ago. Others will be vastly more sophisticated, and they will be able to reason and plan, draw on multiple data sources, work in concerts or swarms with other agents to do very complicated things. Arguably, a Waymo self-driving robo-taxi is actually a network of agents working simultaneously in order to move you safely through the physical world. So robots will be agents or have networks of agents running inside them. And so where this is really important to understand the impact is that we're moving away just in a few years from this idea that AI is going to be an answer machine for all the things that we want to know, to really the idea that AI is the powering spirit or the animus of systems which can proactively act on data and information and take action in useful and commercially valuable ways. So these agents have commercial intent. And that's why I think people are so excited now because, a year ago, people were kind of struggling to think about what the real ROI of some of these generative AI tools was going to be. But with AI agents, it's pretty clear exactly what they can and will do.
So what do you see as being some of the, or maybe you're seeing as you're traveling around the planet, what are some of the examples that you're seeing of where this technology is being applied and having benefit today?
So you can think of it in sort of two buckets, front of house, back of house. The most obvious areas are in the back office, so business workflows, call centers, processes, even the functions of entire departments. If you can describe it, you can automate it. But if you can ask for it, you can also create some sort of cognitive tool that will really accelerate the process of making a decision without the boundaries of departments and silos that we created for human beings. And this is already happening today. If you've probably been seeing Salesforce is talking about digital labor now. They're kind of rewriting all of their applications to basically work with agents. In marketing, HubSpot are doing the same. Of course, Microsoft is heavily invested in this. And on their Dynamics platforms, Amazon Q. I mean, this is. If you look closely at all the big enterprise software players, they really see that agents are both a huge opportunity in that it allows you to redesign the interface and how we use information, and a massive threat because they change the way that we will use software and potentially the way we will buy and provision software. But the other side of the house is something we often forget about, but it's the thing that touches us all the time, which is the customer experience. And the truth is we will all have our own personal agents very soon. They will shop on our behalf. They will sometimes sit in on calls on our behalf, the ones that we can't be bothered attending. They may even go on dates on our behalf, help us screen partners, which sounds terrifying.
Especially if it makes the kind of mistakes that Siri makes every now and again when I ask it to.
Well, that'd be even funny if it's on a date.
Yeah.
But there will be representatives though. So if you think about that, a lot of the traffic in the future on websites and digital channels won't even be human. It'll be our agents interacting on those platforms, and this is already interestingly creating is going to create problems. Because if you use OpenAI's Operator, which is their agent tool, which is now just been released, there are some sites that already will block you because they realize it's non-human traffic. So one of the other side projects that Sam Altman's invested in used to be called WorldCoin. Now it's just called World. It was a little ominous. Basically, you get your eyeball scanned by some mysterious, like Illuminati silver orb, and in reward, it gives you some cryptocurrency, right? So it was kind of like that was, and people were kind of like, I don't know what this is for. Now it's clear what this is for, because the idea is that once your identity gets locked into the blockchain, it'll be able to be tied eventually to a personal AI agent, so that you can actually say that agent is now acting on your behalf. It's like a blue tick mark for that virtual extension of yourself. And it's kind of wild that these people had that foresight to think about that. But that is going to be a very real thing in the next 18 months when we're using agents. How do we know that agent actually represents this particular human and can be authorized to make transactions and representations on their behalf?
Which, gets us back to this notion of trust. So trust, I would argue, is the sort of the foundational bedrock of society. If you need proof of how deeply wired it is into us, look at the social experiments run on chimpanzees. When you deceive a chimpanzee, like, it loses its mind. Like, we are really deeply evolutionarily wired. Trust is kind of like the bedrock operating system, if you like, that we operate under. With a lot of these technologies, it's harder to trust what you see. It's harder to trust what you hear, because, of course, these generative tools are so powerful. But to your point, it's harder to even trust in who you're interacting with now, is I guess the point you're making. So part of the role you're saying here is business potentially stepping in to fill the void. What role do you think government plays in establishing some of the parameters around both trust, but also the degree of agency that these devices have?
I think it's interesting having this conversation in Australia, frankly, because people in other countries have a different frame of reference to this. So if you're sitting in the United States, probably right now, your inclination is, let's get the government out of these decisions as much as possible. If you're in Australia, your operating assumption is that the government should have already solved it for us by now. Because I don't know what it is about Australians. I don't know where that comes from, our penal colony backgrounds. But there's this sort of sense that there should be some central authority that is kind of should make sure we don't hurt ourselves in any way.
Yeah.
We're very much a country that is expecting the government to stop us cutting our own fingers off. And in Europe, I would argue regulation is their form of innovation in many cases, right? And these are controversial statements, and they're not always entirely true. But I think the question of regulation of AI is not something we can leave up to governments. But it's also not something that is, that is necessarily bad for innovation. And the reason for that is that a lot of our assumption with AI is that it's kind of like a gremlin that it's perfectly fine until you feed it after a certain time, and then it's just going to wake up and go nuts. And it just isn't like that. Like I said at the beginning, there are many different types of I guess, intelligence. And the degree of autonomy that we give these AIs to act on our behalf is not going to be something that can be easily regulated because it's not always proportional to the risk. And this is really counterintuitive. I just wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review last week on this, really entitled, how much freedom should we give these AI agents? And the intuitive answer would be, the bigger the risk involved, the more likely you should have a human in the loop to sign off on the answer. I mean, that's what you would think, right? So, let's take Waymo, robotaxis. Probably one of the most dangerous situations you can imagine is a high-powered car driving a bunch of precious humans around in it, right? So you would think there should be a person at all times watching to make sure those cars don't go off the road and can literally take over and start driving it. But perversely, if you actually had that approach, it would probably lead to a lot more accidents, because remote driving is actually super dangerous. There's a lot of latency, and you can't always navigate out of a situation like that. So what actually happens is that, and let's not forget, it would be outrageously expensive if you now replaced a taxi driver with a highly paid AI engineer to drive everyone around. Right, the economics of that business would make Webvan or Pets.com, look like the best idea ever, right? So,
That's a throwback.
so that would be terrible. So what actually happens, right? So if you're riding in a self-driving taxi, and it encounters situations it doesn't understand, the remote operator doesn't take over. The car starts talking to the support team and say, "Hey, I'm noticing this on the road. Like, should I be concerned? What is it? I'm not quite sure how to process it." And basically, the operator starts almost training the AI about, oh, that's just a traffic cone. You can go around it. So the operator is actually answering the AI, helping it to understand what it's seeing. So the role of the human being is not to take over in high danger situations, but to provide more data and context from a human perspective, which trains the AI to get better with time. And if the AI is really struggling, the car will just pull safely to one side, right, until the ambiguity is resolved. So it's not an obvious thing about how much regulation or control we should have over these systems. It's more nuanced.
It does introduce the concept, though, of, I mean, you trained as a lawyer or began your career training as a lawyer. It does introduce then, though, the idea of accountability into this, though, doesn't it? Because, I mean, if you've ever read the T's and C's of a software product, it basically disavows responsibility for anything, including the fact that the software might even work. Do you see a situation whereby the lawyers, again, and I guess government and law are intertwined, you can't really extricate one from the other. Does the question make sense? Because it then becomes a question of whose fault is it that was in a car accident, for example?
Well, I mean, look, I think that's a huge topic in itself. I mean, I would argue that there's strict liability, right? So, these things are products. If you're a consumer of them and these things crash, they're responsible.
Do you see, especially as you travel the world, the risk of any false paths or money pits that people might consume, that might consume a lot of business money or government money and yield little results? Are there anything out there that you look at the moment, think that looks suspiciously like another Pets.com?
This is a live issue literally today, because in the last few weeks, a bombshell's gone off in the AI community, and that is DeepSeek R1.
I was about to ask you about DeepSeek.
Yeah. So basically, you've got this Chinese company that managed to build arguably a superior product to anything that OpenAI or any of the major competitors have done. They basically spent years and billions of dollars to build. DeepSeek did in 2 months for $5.6 million. Now, there's some controversy around some of this because they probably used a distillation model where they were, taking some results and data from the other engines and using it to accelerate the process. But there's just no doubt, though, that they've managed to do something in a far more cost-effective, efficient way. And it's a very, it's all also open source, right? And the impact on this has had immediate economic impacts because, kind of ironically, at the same time, they were announcing Project Stargate, $500 billion on AI data centers. And, NVIDIA's stock price goes crazy because it's like, wow, we're going to need lots more of these $50,000 chips. Then this startup from China comes out of nowhere and it looks like, well, actually, it turns out we can do a lot more with a lot less. And we may not need as much of this infrastructure as we thought. So I think almost like I saw today, almost like $1 trillion has been wiped off the big tech companies. It's kind of like a financial weapon, frankly. And it's funny that DeepSeek itself was created by a quant trading firm as a side hustle. So you can't make this stuff up, right? This is like high stakes drama right now. But I ultimately see this as a positive thing because you don't want eventually a small group of companies controlling intelligence, because in the end, you're not going to be paying for a subscription or tokens to ask some questions. You're going to be eventually in a position where you'll be paying for decisions. And that is not something you want concentrated in the hands of a few people, governments, countries, corporations. You want to democratize intelligence. Uh, you want people to install it on their mobile phone or their own home server. You don't necessarily want the AI that's running your house to be connected to the cloud, right? You don't want the brain implant in your head being controlled by some remote server that if you stop paying your monthly subscription, you suddenly become 20 base points stupider, right? Like in a world where intelligence is everywhere, you want it to be free.
That's a really good point. We're unfortunately going to run out of time shortly, and I'd love to get you back on if we could. There's so much more to talk about. We talked a bit about leadership, and I suppose the importance of leadership from a government standpoint, from an enterprise standpoint. You talk about the algorithmic leader. What does the future look like to the algorithmic leader? What are some of the skills they need? And I think, to paraphrase a question you asked recently, well, maybe I'll ask the question, what do you mean by the rhetorical question, are we lacking in ambition?
I think these are two questions. I mean, for me to be an algorithmic leader, and I chose algorithmic, by the way, rather than AI, because algorithms have been around for thousands of years. In a way, they've grown up along with storytelling as a core technology of human civilization. An algorithm is basically a recipe. It's a series of steps to do something, but it's like someone's taken some deep thought about the way the world works and embedded in a formula that can then spread mimetically, right? So to be an algorithmic leader in this new era means two things for me. It means a deep understanding of human complexity, really understanding what motivates people, what drives people, what's a great customer experience, these analog qualities. But it also means to be able to think computationally, which is not only to know how to apply technology to a decision, but to be able to break a problem down into smaller pieces and approach the problem strategically, like a poker player would, right? And when you do that, the decision, whether you get it right or wrong, is not as important as the process by which you approach the decision. And that is probably the single biggest insight, I think, for any leader in this new world, which is that it doesn't matter whether you got the decision right or wrong. What matters is whether you, over time, personally, but also at scale, with you and your team or your organization, are building a better system and model for evaluating and executing high quality decisions. So if you take that frame of reference, AI becomes just another tool in your kit for how you improve that decision-making environment. And we look at it like that. There's nothing to be frightened of, right? That's the superpower that you can then gain, which has always been an edge, right? Think about Syracuse, the famous story of the Romans laying siege to this ancient town. They held them off forever. Why? Because Archimedes was there inventing with his mind genius weapons of war that completely frustrated the Romans, right? And that's what AI is for us. It gives us superpowers, but only if we approach it with that mentality.
I love it. Talk to me about ambition.
So the problem is that you ignore all of that and you just focus on building, using AI for making more ad-generated platforms, social media, games, things that draw us into, pits of attention like TikTok. And unfortunately, I think in the last 10 years, we've devoted way too much attention on building these consumer apps that are really just, kind of, I would say, not just a waste of engineering talent, but probably psychological weapons that are destroying, the minds of all of us. And I think this is a lack of ambition. For me, AI raises a much more interesting question, which is what actually would a fully autonomous AI-powered civilization look like? If we could fundamentally reinvent the way we make things, the way we communicate, the way we make decisions, the way we run cities, how we solve some of these really big, complex challenges. And if we could do that in a way that has an abundant mindset towards energy, right? So we're now not just trying to cut back on flying and, building data centers, but we're like, okay, the fact is to power an AI-powered civilization, you're going to need lots of energy, but there's more abundant and renewable sources of energy than we thought were possible. So it kind of pretty much moves us whole civilization onto another level, right? That's ambition. And it's something we're not seeing enough of.
Fascinating thought. Again, a whole nother conversation you and I can have about that. I want to wrap up talking a little bit about the future, because I need to build a dossier of failed claims that I can embarrass you with in 5 years' time. Where do you see, looking forward 5 years, 10 years, the 20th anniversary of the Dictionary of Dangerous Ideas? What do you see the future looking like?
You probably should ask about Futurtainment. That was my first book, and that had some more obvious embarrassing failures of foresight in there, which actually is coming up to its 20th anniversary, actually.
There you go.
But I would say, the big thing that you want to be looking at in the next 5 years is the rise of digital labor, and not just in I guess digital form, virtual form, but in embodied form in robotics. Because if you're looking closely now, all the big tech players, AI companies, and even auto players are building robots. And the reason for that is actually existential. We have declining birth rates, Despite this sort of idea of overpopulation, the truth is that there is a global talent shortage, and there's going to be a labor shortage of able-bodied people to work in farms, to work in healthcare, to support us as we're getting old, to do heavy lifting, to do dangerous tasks. Either we won't be able to physically do it, or we won't want to do it. But this is going to be, in some countries in particular, like if you look at Japan, South Korea, I mean, this is already a big demographic problem. So that's going to be the area to watch, because you're going to see more and more investment in it. And it's probably the single biggest thing that's going to transform the economics of the world that we're in.
Inspirational answer. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I literally could have gone on for hours with you. There's so many big ideas there that are worth tackling. Again, to all of our listeners, if you haven't checked out Mike's work, absolutely do so. It's a lot of fun, whether it's face-to-face at an event or his books. And thank you all to Cloudera for hosting another episode of the AI Forecast. Thanks to you all for tuning in. Not that you tune in, because we don't have radios anymore. As I mentioned at the beginning, make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. We'd love to hear from you. So if you do have feedback, or if you've got ideas for a topic you'd like to hear covered, reach out to Cloudera on LinkedIn using the handle @Cloudera. And with that, we will see you all. Well, you'll see us. I won't see you because we don't have that technology yet next week.